So I'm going to get into reasons why I believe in God. First is the most obvious, is Scripture. There is a voluminous amount of Old Testament prophecies that speak to Jesus, and it can only mean Jesus. And not to mention that, but the Bible, the Old Testament and New Testament, create a unified whole, which shows that the books are being written. They somehow connect together in such fascinating ways. You could spend your entire life studying it, and it's just like, wow, these things back in the Old Testament are prophesying the New Testament. The things in the New Testament are looking back to the Old Testament, and it's not these like superficial kind of things. They're actually what the text means. The second thing is math. Now, physical space has specific laws that it must follow, and there is a supposed genius that said math might work different on Pluto. It doesn't work differently on Pluto, because the rules of space, when you have three-dimensional space, a circle is always going to be dictated by the number pi, and a square is always going to be the base unit of, or a cube is always going to be the base unit of 3 and 2-dimensional space, always going to be. And it's kind of amazing how that works that way, and not to mention calculus is always going to work, because it's a very difficult thing to explain, but basically by taking those numbers and then dividing them by the proportion, you get the limit, which is kind of interesting, because the reason why that happens is because it's just predicting where the pattern is going to go, and it's always going to work. It's a fundamental theorem. And you have quadratic equations too. They just always work. It just always does. So, that's one of the reasons why I believe in God. Another is the comprehensibility of language. I think because there is reality, that's how communication works. And building a case for God on the fundamental basis of reality, it might sound kind of stupid, but there's a lot of people that deny reality. They deny that reality really is. And I think having a fundamental basis in concrete reality where this conversation can be understood, and that's how language works, is that it draws from reality, real things, and even if the real thing might have some falsehood in it, there's other real things that piece together that help us understand what's being said. You can never communicate something that simply cannot exist. Everything that is communicated is based in something that does exist, and the more it exists, the more concrete that thing becomes. So that's just a fact. The more real something is, the more concretely you can communicate it. And that reality that God establishes, I think it must be established in God. Another reason why I believe is because of the moral consistency of the Bible. Now, a lot of you might think the Old Testament's very cruel, and it's supposed to be. The Old Testament is the law that judges the world and destroys it. So the law of the Old Testament, it puts every man, woman, and child under a sentence of death, and it's just meant to teach us what is sin. So it's meant to teach us. And the New Testament frees us from that law and gives us a law of conscience, which isn't saying we must do these things, but rather through a willing heart and through love of God, you're empowered to do these things. Like Jesus' words, like in the Gospels of the Sermon on the Mount, or his words in Paul's letters of Romans chapter 12 through 15. These are some of the most salient moral arguments ever, like when Jesus is talking about the sheep and the goats. And that's another reason why I believe in Jesus, because Jesus, although the Gospel of John kind of makes him you sort of question whether he is the Messiah in the Gospel of John, you kind of see this it's like this isn't making sense until you see that literally there's miracles happening, and this is an actual witness. It cannot be anything but. You read the Gospel of John, it has to be a witness, and you see that Jesus actually performed miracles. Not only that, you see Jesus become more and more salient as the book goes on. He becomes more and more credible. It's like in the beginning he's like, he's not really that credible at all. It's like you're like, oh, this guy's kind of a lunatic, and then at the end of it you're just like, wow, this guy is like perfectly salient. He's not eccentric at all. It's just he's just saying something that's hard to communicate. And then you realize in the other Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, that this man was an absolute genius. How does a poor carpenter's son with no education, as the book of John says, he has no learning, how does this person from Samaria, he came from Galilee, he was born in Bethlehem, he was a full-born Jew of the Davidic bloodline, but he settled up in Galilee. It's like, why is this person able to outthink some of the most educated men in history? The Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, these men were ate, bred, and lived scholarship. They understood everything. They say the Sanhedrin altogether could speak every language in the entire known world. So how could this possibly be that Jesus would beat them in arguments, and Jesus clearly won those arguments. And how could this possibly be? This was not a learned scholar. This was just a man who basically knew his Bible. How is that possible? That this poor carpenter's son, he's not even the guy's son. He says, I'm going to use this word, don't get offended, Christians, but this is what they would have thought of him back then. He's basically Joseph's bastard son. Why is this person able to outthink and outperform Pharisees? Why is he able to do this? He shouldn't be this smart. And he didn't seem to have a learning. He didn't go to school like I did. Jesus didn't go to school. You know what I mean? He didn't have a really exuberant upbringing. He didn't even have a bed to lay his head down on. It says that in the Psalms, which is again gets back to the Bible speaking of Jesus, like the Psalms. It says in the Psalms, the volume of the book is written of me. So you understand this. It's like, how does this man accomplish this kind of stuff? Like, sums up all ethics in 6,000 words, creates stories as perfect as Grimm's fairy tales, lives a life that is itself poetry. Like, let's just get it this way. When you read the Gospel of John, you see a poetic life that very few people can live. Even at his death, when the water poured out of his side, that's symbolic. Now, that is consistent with the heart attack. Since Jesus had a heart attack on the cross, and when they punctured his ribs, it burst the fluid sac that's around the heart, and that's what it is. But even that, there's a poetic symbolism in it. How does this man perfectly live this poetic life? And that's my most compelling reason for believing in Jesus, is that he was some kind of genius, and he wasn't crazy, and he was perfectly in his right mind. At the beginning, you're like, this guy could be crazy, but then at the end, you're just like, he's not. Like, he's a genius, and then you're just like, wow, like this is amazing that this person with no education, abjectly poor, he's homeless, he has 12 guys that follow him around, and big crowds want him to heal them and stuff like that. This guy is just wiping the floor with some of the most educated men that ever lived. These men, Pharisees, they were scholars in Roman, Judaic law. They're scholars in all sophistry, so all forms of science at the time. They understood it. So these men were no pushovers. They could give any of our modern scholars a run for their monies, and they understood a lot of things, probably even better than we do today. And Jesus wiped the floor with them. And really, on that act is why I believe in Jesus, is the fact that he is that salient, he is that guy, and that's why I want him to be my righteousness.